Have you ever looked at Surfline and thought the conditions would be great, only to show up to flat waves, 0 barrels, and just a lot of chaos? Well, I'm a wave enthusiast, and I know it can be complicated to predict the conditions, especially accurately. So I'm gonna break it down so even non-surfers can know how to predict the conditions when you go to the beach. Let's get right into it. There are 4 main factors that contribute to the quality of a surf day: the swell, the wind, the tide, and the underwater surface that the waves break on. Let's start with swells. Swells are formed by faraway storms. The wind from the storms create ripples that can travel for miles all the way to our coast. These ripples are called swells. As the swells hit the coast, they rise and eventually break. One interesting fact about swells is until they break, the water going over a swell isn't actually moving, it's just rising and falling. The next most important thing to talk about is underwater surfaces. Underwater surfaces are almost as important as swells break because of underwater surfaces. Sandbars and reefs are different types of underwater surfaces. The biggest difference between them is that reefs are permanent, while sandbars move because of, being made of sand. Sand is easily moved by water, and is sort of also created by water, but that's a whole other thing. As swells approach the coast, the wave bottom hits the surface, and depending on the water depth and shape of the surface, the wave will break differently, forming a variety of different shapes that I will explain later. Next, let's talk about tides. Tides are equally as important. The moon's gravitational pull causes the ocean to bulge out on either side of the earth that's closest or farthest from the moon. As the earth rotates, we experience high and low tides according to the position of the moon. The bulge closest to the moon creates high tide, and the bulge farthest from the moon is a low tide. Tides affect how well the wave bottoms hit the sandbar or reef. High tide typically creates softer waves because the wave doesn't hit the underwater surface as violently, while low tide does just the opposite. Wind is simply the finishing touch to surf conditions, like icing on a cake. Also like icing on a cake, it can make or break a surf day, just like icing can absolutely make a cake taste terrible. Offshore wind, when the wind is blowing from the shore towards the water, generally keeps the waves open and groomed, making that perfect barrel at low tide, while onshore wind, over 6 miles per hour, tends to flatten and mess up surf conditions. Wind is created by air traveling from high pressure to low pressure. But certain terrain items like mountains and cliffs and valleys create friction, which can divert the wind. Keep in mind, low wind that's onshore or offshore can actually also perfect waves. But this just means some certain spots will just not have offshore wind very often because of the terrain. Just like here, we barely ever get offshore wind. So it takes a lot of hunting around to find that perfect day with that offshore wind. Now that you know the 4 main factors what create different surf conditions, it's time for the fun part. The main thing that you do whenever you go to the beach. That's looking at the different wave shapes. Let's talk about wave shapes. There's a lot of different types of waves. Every time you go to the beach, you'll see almost all of them, but today we're going to be talking about the main ones you'll see. Let's get to it. First, let's talk about spilling or crumbling waves. These are the softest type of wave. They tend to spill over or crumble, and sometimes they even close out. They're not ideal for surfing, as there's not much power behind them, and a lot of surfers will just not even go out if they see only crumbling waves. These waves are created by soft sloping sandbars or mellow reefs or deep water. The shape can also be made by onshore wind or even high tide when there is offshore wind. Next, let's talk about barreling waves. These are one of the most powerful types of wave, and definitely the prettiest, but they're also the rarest. They're perfect for surfers that are skilled enough to ride them. With barreling waves, the lip plunges heavily into the water, and it can seriously injure someone who gets hit by it. It creates a tube where a surfer can ride inside if they're skilled enough to be able to position themselves and hang back and not get too deep or miss the barrel. Barrels can be made by shallow sandbars or reefs, and at beach breaks they are typically made by offshore or no wind. Low tide is almost a must, especially at beach breaks. Keep in mind they are steep, and they aren't beginner friendly. Now for the dreaded slab. Slabs are like a more intense version of a barreling wave. While you might just think they are just some other version of a barrel, they're almost not. They're an entire another tier of wave, and they're not chased by the average surfer. The difference between a slab and a barrel is that a slab is created by an extremely shallow underwater surface, to the point where sometimes the underwater surface is even sticking out of the water, being called a dry reef. Typically, there can be dry sand, but it's not very common. Slabs are very common at beach breaks, but they're usually very inconsistent, and surfers tend to avoid them. Slabs are extremely powerful. They are the most powerful type of wave. Technically, slabs are still surfable, but they're definitely not ideal for the average surfer. And they're only around if it's absolutely low tide, as they break because of that super shallow water, and high tide typically will make it too high for the slabs to form. Now that we've talked about the most common wave shapes, I'm going to summarize for you guys what will make a good day and what will make a bad day. Let's start with bad day. Too strong of onshore winds will always make the conditions flatter and more chaotic. Always look at the wind forecast before going out surfing. The next thing to look for is too high of a tide. High tide can be a really, really bad thing, and at certain surf spots it's not even possible to surf with too high of a tide. Next, make sure you know your spot. If you're at a big long beach, look down the beach and see where you see the most consistently forming waves, and go surf there. Certain underwater surfaces or sandbars or reefs will just break better than others, and this can change. Sandbars specifically can change. So if you're looking down a sand beach and you're seeing a spot that looks good, go surf it, but just know it might not be there the next time you go. Next, having too big or too small of a swell. Certain sandbars or reefs won't even be able to hold waves when the swell is too small or too big. Some are more easy to predict, and others are specifically situational, which is unfortunate for people who only have one surf spot around. But if you live near a big long beach, you'll be able to find something, I'm sure. But too big of waves can be too hard to surf or too chaotic, and they might break too far out so that you might have to use a jet ski to get to them. Too small of waves is just not fun. Next, let's talk about what makes a good day, and that is low wind or offshore wind. Offshore wind obviously grooms the waves and makes them stay open for longer, but low wind can also be a really great thing, as it almost doesn't affect the waves. And certain sandbars obviously will not be good, but if you have a good sandbar and low wind, the waves should break how they're supposed to. Next is the tide. Low tide will almost always be better, unless it's too shallow during low tide or there's too much current. Low tide is a really great time to surf because it is when the waves are the hollowest. If you're able to surf hollow waves, then it is definitely the best time. Next is having a mid-sized swell. Obviously, too big or too small waves is not good, but if you have a mid-sized swell, advanced surfers will be able to surf them and still have a little bit of excitement while not being overwhelmed by the size. The last and most important thing of all is having a good sandbar or reef. If you don't have a good sandbar or reef, you're not going to have good waves, no matter what. It might be that the sandbar is more shallow. It might be that it breaks for longer. Who knows? But having a good sandbar is key. And even on the worst of days, sometimes you might be able to find a couple good ones, even if it is just gale force onshore winds. Always make sure you know your spots, and don't always go where everybody else is going. Sometimes the best waves are hidden.